Hello, everyone. Hi. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to a conversation about the genocide in Gaza and the current crisis in Rafah, sponsored by the UO Palestine Coalition, including organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, Students for Justice in Palestine, Muslim Student Association, YDSA, ROAR, Gaza Palestine, FSJP. We are gathered over 8 months into the genocide in Gaza as countless Palestinians are facing malnutrition, and this conversation intends to fill some of the educational gaps at this university to provide a space to discuss Palestine, the genocide, and educate ourselves on this crisis and our complicity in it. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and Law Professor here, Michael Fakhri. He teaches in the areas of international economic law, commercial law, and food law. His research focuses on the right to food and agroecology. His theoretical agenda involves investigating law's role in imperial and capitalist adventures, and he is a faculty member of the Environmental and Natural Resource Law Center, where he co-leads the Food Resiliency Project. Since 2020, he has also held the position of UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, where he reports both to the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly on the right to food. Now please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Fakhri.
I think this one, thanks. Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you, everyone. I miss my comrades. I miss my friends. I miss everyone here. I miss working with all of you. What an amazing several months it's been. My thanks to all the organizers. My thanks to the students. So what I'm going to do today is a couple of things. First, I'll explain what is this position of UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. So that way you get a sense of the perspective that I'm speaking from, the experiences that I'm drawing from, and sort of where I'm going with some of these ideas. So this position, it's a volunteer position, and my mandate is the right to food, and there's over 40 other mandates. So things like the right to water, the right to housing, freedom of association, freedom of religion, etc. And our job is to be the eyes, ears, and sometimes good conscience for the UN system. In my case, with a focus on all matters regarding hunger, malnutrition, and famine from a human rights perspective. I present reports to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly, which means I get to tell governments what they need to pay attention to. I pick the themes of the reports, I focus the agenda, and governments are obliged to respond to what I present to them. I also present allegations to governments when there's human rights violations. And so one way to think of this position is sort of like an avatar for these particular rights. So in my case, it's the right to food. This fall, and I think right now the date is October 18th, but it's still not 100% confirmed, I'll be presenting my next report to the UN General Assembly in New York. And the topic of that report and the topic of today's talk is the right to food and starvation, with an emphasis on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty. Much of what I have to say comes from that report, but it's still a work in progress. I still have to finish it in the next few weeks. So everything I say is technically off the record. It's not in my official capacity. I'm speaking to you today as a colleague, as a comrade, as a middle-aged dad who brought his child to an inappropriate talk, but he has headphones, so that's okay. And so also, you know, we're over 8 months into this Israeli war in Gaza. So I want to use this opportunity to reflect with you all. I've given talks all over the world. Part of the job of being a UN Special Rapporteur is I talk to everybody. I talk to heads of state, diplomats, ambassadors, activists, peasant movements, social movements, NGOs, heads of the different UN organizations, heads of different humanitarian relief organizations. And my job is to learn from everybody. By talking to everyone, I learn from everyone, and then I share publicly what I learn. So that's why I want to use this moment to reflect all this sort of learning, and it's been quite intense, as you can imagine. So I'm not speaking with this sort of voice of authority. What's interesting is when I write these reports or when I put out press releases, even when I tweet, they're considered authoritative interpretations on the right to food. So for example, I tweeted something. It happened to be this guy's birthday. He's bothering me because he needed balloons. And I'm like, Baba, I need to tweet this. Baba, I need to tweet this. And he's like, Baba, I need balloons. And I send it, and there was a typo, and it got cited by the South African government in their case at the International Court of Justice. So I'm just happy to speak to you just as a normal human being today, who still makes typos. So it's 251 days into Israel's starvation campaign and genocide in Gaza, and I've been tracking it every single day since it started. And in the past few months, what I've been doing is I've been calling for action. So I've been chastising governments for only offering empty words. I've been frustrated with international courts for only offering garbled words. And I've been frustrated with politicians for only giving us dishonest words. And I think I'm taking now this moment to reflect and to give myself the space and grace to change through this experience. And I think I might have made a mistake, making too hard of a distinction between words and action. So I've been calling for things like a ceasefire, humanitarian aid through land, economic and political sanctions against Israel, the stopping of US, Canadian, Australian, and European military and financial support to Israel, UO divestment from genocide and apartheid. And I still think those things must happen. But I think how we understand what's going on, how we frame things, the words we use does matter. Because what we're facing is horror. And the only way we're going to be able to overcome any horror in life is to be able to name it properly. And that's really what today is about, naming and framing. And I will share with you sort of how I think change happens. I don't think change happens necessarily because I write some report or we change a law or the International Court of Justice says something. Those things do matter. But ultimately, I think change happens by changing our relationships, either changing our existing relationships or reconfiguring our relationships. That's how power gets made and reconfigured. And so us meeting here like this, seeing old comrades and friends, making new friends, that's already a source of change. The student encampments across North America and around the world, and our own campus, were and remain a powerful force of change. In fact, I believe that the student movements, including the University of Oregon student movement, is the most powerful political force against genocide and supporting Palestinian human rights in the belly of the beast in the United States today. The student movement has been a force of change for solidarity and liberation. No matter what happens with those negotiations or resistance against university administrators and the police, those new relationships that were created through the encampments have already been a force for progressive change. So as I've said, I've been closely tracking Israel's war against Gaza since October on a daily basis. And I can tell you, never in modern history has a people been made to go so hungry, so quickly, and so completely. What I mean by that is 2.3 million people were made to go hungry almost instantaneously. That's never happened. In fact, there are many elements in this war that are unprecedented. Never have children been pushed into malnutrition so quickly. Never have so many children been killed or maimed in any modern war. Never have so many humanitarian and UN workers been killed in a war. Never have been so many journalists been killed in a war. By this past December, 80% of the world's population facing famine were all in Gaza. But the reason I'm presenting these statistics and these facts isn't as an argument. None of us should have to explain why the humanity of Palestinians or anyone matters. Nor should we compare atrocities or different horror to justify acts of solidarity, resistance, and liberation. The reason I've mentioned these statistics and facts is there's something about, ever since the COVID-19 pandemic, we keep using that word, unprecedented. So I can tell you, in Sudan today, we've never seen this large a number of people facing famine. Again, we keep using this word unprecedented to describe our reality. It's because with climate change accelerating the effects of imperialism and capitalism, the future is looking more violent for most people on the planet right now. That's what's going on. We truly are in times of profound change and transformation. So like I said, I'm focusing on words and framing not as a semantic exercise, and not just to be able to name the horror that people are facing in Palestine, but also to be able to imagine a way through it. I was just telling a friend, the last time I was in this building, I got to meet Ursula Le Guin, who passed away, and she's a great example of someone who is able to imagine fundamental different relationships, fundamental different ways of thinking about equality, and creating a new future. I'm nowhere near Ursula Le Guin. I'm not saying that for the record, just feeling her vibes right now. So what my plan is, I'll explain what the right to food is in general terms, what sort of informs my mandate, but I think the right to food can give us a way to understand things, to look at things, to organize things. It's a concept that can help us understand what is at stake. Then I'm going to describe what's going on in Gaza and against the Palestinians as genocide, and I'll explain why that word matters. And then I'll introduce this idea of starvation and connect it to genocide. And then I'll conclude briefly with this notion of food sovereignty and what that means for the Palestinian people. So what I'm doing, I'm just sort of outlining a lot of different places for everyone to enter the conversation when I'm done. So on the right to food. So the right to food, in many ways, it's almost like we don't have to explain that food is a human right. For me, it's there with water and housing and health. But generally, it can be understood as the right to be free from hunger. That notion of freedom is very important, because what that tells us is that hunger is not caused by the fact that there isn't enough food. Historically speaking, whenever there is hunger, malnutrition, or famine, it is always because of political shortcomings. It's always because of institutions not doing what they're supposed to do. So hunger is always a political problem. So by framing it as freedom from hunger, what that means is that we're talking about the causes of hunger are oppression, exploitation, and occupation. So when we talk about the right to food, it's about freedom from oppression, exploitation, and occupation. And that's why I think the right to food is helpful to understand what is at stake. But that's telling you what the causes of hunger are. But eating food should be pleasurable. It shouldn't just be about hunger and famine and freedom from this awful thing and freedom from that awful thing. So I think another way to think about the right to food is it's the right to celebrate life with each other through our meals in communion. And we often do that in our day. It doesn't have to be a holiday. It could be in our everyday meals. But also think of every single holiday that you celebrate or avoid or whatever. Food's always a central feature of how we celebrate in that higher way. So that's just a general idea of the right to food. And I'm going to revisit this notion of freedom towards the end. So let me turn to why I think what's going on in Gaza, but against the Palestinian people more broadly, is a genocide. So in the early days of the war, and this was on October 15th. So if Hamas attacks on October 7th, Israel announces its starvation and genocide campaign on October 8th. By October 15th, over 400 scholars in the fields of international law, genocide studies, Holocaust studies raised the alarm, saying Israel is probably committing genocide right now. Soon after, 4 days later on October 19th, me and several other special rapporteurs followed suit, and we called for the prevention of genocide. And I happened to be in New York at the time. I happened to be presenting to the General Assembly when all this started happening. So I was also meeting face-to-face with ambassadors from a lot of different countries and presenting to the General Assembly saying, you have to do whatever you can to prevent genocide, me and other special rapporteurs. And I think me and the other special rapporteurs were the first, and I think we might still be the only voices within the entire UN system framing this as a genocide. And I can tell you, amongst other special rapporteurs, you can imagine over 40 experts. And we're always told, you are the expert. So we're all divas of various sorts, myself included. On the application, are you a diva? Yes. But you can imagine all these different perspectives, all these different experts, all these leading voices from around the world on human rights. There was huge disagreements as to how do we name this? Is this a crime against humanity? Is this ethnic cleansing? Is this a war crime? Is this genocide? My short answer, but I'll walk through some of those briefly, but my short answer is it's all of them, but how we name it is a choice. We're making meaning in this moment, and that's one of the most political acts one can do. But I can also tell you, and many of you I think have experienced this, whether it's in Gaza or other situations you've witnessed or experienced, when you're confronted with a certain degree of violence, it's hard to make meaning. It really is very difficult. So that's what's at stake. So several of us sort of came together and we saw it as genocide and put out that press release. And soon after, more and more colleagues signed on and sort of understood it in those terms. And I've been reflecting in the last couple weeks, asking myself, why did some of us see it? I can't speak to those that didn't see it. It's hard for me to put myself in those shoes. But I was trying to think, what was it about those of us that saw it? I think there were 3 reasons. First, I think it was the particular mandates. Those of us that hold these particular mandates. So it was food, water, housing, and health. The mandate holders, as we're sometimes called, those were the people where it was so clear that what is at stake here is genocide. Because these are the mandates which I think cover the essentials of life. And then we were also supported in our framing of genocide by the mandate holder on violence against women and internally displaced people, and of course by the mandate holder addressing occupied Palestinian territories. So first reason, if you're looking at food, housing, water, health, you're probably going to see genocide when it's happening. The second, I think, has to do with just a good understanding of history and geography. Many of us knew that this didn't start on October 7th, or that it didn't even start in Gaza. We could see genocide for what it was. We understood that this was a case of settler colonialism, creating 75 years of apartheid, 56 years of belligerent occupation of Palestinian territory, and 16 years of a blockade against Gaza. Once you have that understanding of geography and history, then that's the correct context to at least start understanding what's going on. And the third reason, I think many of us, the mandate holders, had to do with who we were as individuals. More people than you think have experienced genocide. And what I mean by that is genocide does not just affect the people that were killed or that were immediately next to them. Genocide creates a social trauma that overwhelms time and space. Genocide resonates across a region, if not the whole world. And it cuts across, through, and echoes into the future, harming, traumatizing generations into the future, sometimes reproducing and magnifying hate. It has its own dynamic. Anyone who is indigenous, like the Kalapuya people on whose territory we're on, like the Confederated Tribes here in Oregon, they've experienced genocide and continue. Anyone from the former Yugoslavia or from Rwanda, anyone who's Armenian has experienced genocide in the past, and most recently in Azerbaijan. They experienced genocide when they were basically pushed out and exterminated from Nagorno-Karabakh just last year. Not a peep from the world. The Uyghur people, the Rohingya, Black South Africans, Namibians, people of the Congo, other communities in Africa and the Black diaspora. Anyone who's been at war with Israel knows what is genocide. And these are just ones I'm listing. Can you imagine how many instances of genocide maybe we haven't heard if we collectively share what we know? Genocidal tendencies are more common than publicly discussed. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people who've experienced genocide, if we understand it in those terms. And that's why millions of people immediately took to the streets in October and didn't just call for a ceasefire. They called for an end to the genocide. So now, over 8 months later, the degree of carnage against the Palestinian people is happening simply because they are Palestinian. And it's getting harder and harder and harder to describe it. So now with the recent attack with the Nusayrat camp in the south, with the attack on Rafah, again, we're running out of words. And I do a lot of media. This is new for me. And I keep trying to think, like, what else can I say? What else can I say? And there's a point where I'm like, I'm running out of words. How many ways can one describe the thing? Or how many times can one repeat as new and new situations arise? For over 8 months, we've heard Israeli officials, in their own words and through their actions, dehumanize the Palestinian people, treat them as expendable, treating all civilians as legitimate targets. When the dust settles, those of us who've not been in Gaza, only then are we going to fully realize the horror and carnage and the degree of violence that is possible today. So I'm at the point now, if you notice, I'm not arguing it's genocide. I think the onus is on others to explain why they don't think it's genocide. It's interesting, during the encampment and over the year of the divestment campaign, every time an administrator would say something, in my mind, I would add the word like genocide. Oh, we can't divest from genocide. Oh, it's really difficult because it's genocide. Oh, it's so complicated. It's not. It's, A killing B. And that, for me, clarified sort of how people avoid doing stuff. And I keep trying to think, why aren't people naming it like that? And I'll walk through the different ways one can frame it. But I think people in power right now, generally, are very reluctant. They'll call it a war crime. Sometimes they'll even go as far as crime against humanity, and I'll explain the differences. But I think there's something about genocide that requires immediate action and requires a fundamental changing of power and the status quo. So if you're a political leader or president of a university, hypothetically speaking, and your constituents are demanding you do something because it's a genocide, because your institution is complicit, you don't become a political leader usually at that degree of, that high up, unless you benefited from the status quo. So when we're asking our leaders to divest from genocide, we're asking them to change the power structure that they benefit from. That's the battle that we are all facing ahead of us. So, as I mentioned, these other terms, war crimes, crimes against humanity. What's happening are all those things, but each one of them frames it in a different way, frames the stakes in a different way, and provides a different solution, or if you want, a remedy, to use a legal term. So a war crime. What's a war crime? So a war crime is part of the laws of war. It turns out in war there are rules. Sometimes we call it international humanitarian law, but it's the same. And the basic rule is this in the laws of war. You can only target armed combatants. Don't target civilians. If you kill some civilians, let's make sure that it was a mistake or there was no other choice. Generalizing, of course. So what war crimes really focuses on is, one, is there a war? Is it an international conflict or is it a non-international conflict? Because there'll be different rules. Is it a civil war or not? And that creates different rules. And if there's a war, the rules apply. Oh, there's no war, it's just a bunch of people killing other people. Then the rules don't apply. The laws of war are not about preventing war or creating peace. It's about organizing violence in a particular way. That's all it is, how to do war.
They're heading to the more dangerous part.
Well timed, Habibi. So a war crime, very serious, very important to understand. That's where it's situated. So that means there's exceptions. In war, you can starve your enemy, the armed combatant. It's a fair way to harm your enemy. And you can't starve civilians. that's really weird because in the way supply chains work is in effect, it's hard to separate military supply chains from humanitarian supply chains from civilian supply chains. So if you're starving your enemy, the armed combatant, you're inevitably going to starve civilians, but the laws of war allow you to do that. So let's say we find there are war crimes. Now what's the remedy? Let's take a bunch of individuals, find them guilty, and throw them in jail after everything has happened. But I think many of us have experienced or know from criminal law is not a good deterrent. It's not really going to change people's habits or ways or practices, especially in international law, especially in war. If you win the war, it's a lot harder than to charge you for war crime. See every US political leader, right? But it has its, it has its strengths and weaknesses. So that's a war crime. Crimes against humanity is broader. It's not just in wartime. And it's when certain acts are committed as part of a widespread or systemic attack directed against civilians. And the people doing it must have knowledge of the attack. You must be in a position of power and authority, and you must know that that's happening. So it includes things like extermination, which is denying people access to food, water, housing, torture, apartheid. So crime against humanity is very powerful in understanding that larger scale, that systemic element. Nevertheless, it still focuses on individual culpability. It's these bad people that did a bad thing. Let us hold them accountable because of these mass atrocities. And then there's genocide. And genocide is, you have to do it with intent, and you have to intend to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, this is the old language, racial or religious group as such. So in some ways, it's theoretically harder to show genocide. You have to show that there was intent to destroy a group simply for being a group, in whole and in part. Not just that they did it and they knew that that was going to be the effect of what their acts were, but they really intended to try and eliminate a certain people for being a people. But it's not just individuals. Entire governments and countries can be held culpable for genocide. So each concept frames the horrors in a particular way. Each concept also frames the solution, as I said, the remedy, in a different way. That is to say, each concept has a different meaning. There are different stakes. And in different contexts, it's maybe more important to present one versus the other. In this instance in Gaza, often in the press and in the media, they'll say, how do you know it was genocide? It's so difficult to prove genocide. And my short answer, because I usually only have 30 seconds, is because Israel said so. I mean, it's that straightforward. So this is an example where there might be theoretically some conceptual challenges to show intent, or it's a concept that might be limited in certain ways in theory, but in a particular context, it's right there. And more importantly, the remedy. So if we're saying it's not just this bad actor or that bad actor, it's not just Netanyahu and his allies. It is something more systemic. It is that the state of Israel is culpable in this instance for genocide, and that the remedy has to be the full recognition of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, not throw those people in jail. Right? That's why naming it as genocide, I think, matters. It highlights what's at stake and what can be done. So I'll turn to starvation now. So Israel declared its starvation campaign. ماشي الحال حبيبي.
I'm worried about the dog that's in the show.
Okay. In case you were wondering. And for those of you watching, my son is talking. He's just off camera. Not that I'm making light of this topic. So Israel declared a total siege against Gaza on October 8th and October 9th, and then imposed a total siege immediately. So by January, we started to see the effects of Israel's starvation campaign unfold at rates we've never seen. So in December, I could say every single person in Gaza, 2.3 million people, were going hungry, the majority of which are children. And let's also remember who suffers first in these situations. It's always people that have been already made vulnerable before this happened. So women, people with disabilities, older persons. Then from December to March, the number of people facing famine almost doubled. In 1 month, from February to March, we saw the rate of children suffering from acute malnutrition, or what's known as wasting, double across all of Gaza, with the worst rates in the north and central Gaza. Starting in February, and this continues today, children started to die from malnutrition, dehydration, and starvation. So when you know this is happening, that's how you know it's worse than we can even measure. It's hard to measure these things in the midst of a war, but that sign of children dying in that way it tells you a lot. Because of the lack of nutrition, a whole generation is now in danger of suffering from permanent physical and cognitive impairment, what doctors call stunting. So that means that for this generation of children in Gaza to live with dignity in the future is going to require a profound amount of support. Israel has denied and restricted humanitarian aid through this entire war, and they've used humanitarian aid as a bargaining chip. So let me turn to this idea of the right to food. So that's what's going on. And why I think if you look at the right to food, it tells you broadly, it's not just a war, it's not just the denial of humanitarian aid, it's not just what's happening right now in the immediate terms, despite the overwhelming horrors. So as I said, the right to food is about the freedom from hunger. It's not just about calories. It's about living with dignity. And starvation is the most extreme form of hunger. But starvation is always the result of long-standing structural issues. Starvation is always the result of political choices. That means that starvation is always predictable and preventable. And so if we just look at international law, starvation is it's a war crime. Meaning you can only hold people accountable for starvation in the context of a war and only for individuals. But what I'm trying to do in this report that I'll be presenting in New York in October is to say starvation is a fundamental violation of all of international law. That starvation is a form of genocide. It's a very particular way of punishing, harming, and trying to exterminate a people. And so there's something unique about starvation. It is a particular form of cruelty, a particular form of violence. It has its own pace, and often starts slow. And then it unfolds in its own way. So it does affect us biophysically. It affects a person for life. As I mentioned, if you're a child, there's the issue of stunting and wasting. It affects our genes. So there's been studies now showing that if you have experienced famine and starvation, the way your genes express themselves and the way you pass along your genes to your children are traceable. You can track if your ancestors faced famine and starvation or not through your genes. And it's its own form of social trauma. It carries its own type of shame. Now, this is hard with him here. Parents have to choose who to feed first, how much to feed them. And they have to live with that decision. Neighbors will come asking for food, and neighbors will have to turn neighbors away. And when all is done, you still have to live with that person, knowing the effects of you turning away your neighbor. In Ireland, for generations, people couldn't talk about the Great Famine that was created by the British because of that shame that they carried. So there's something very, very particular about starvation. So let me conclude in my remaining time with this idea of food sovereignty. So I've been talking about the right to food, and I've been talking about starvation. To share with you, for reasons that's still not clear to me, the people and institutions that focus on the right to food are over here. These are the human rights folk. And then the experts and institutions and people that deal with starvation are over here. They tend to be humanitarian relief and that sort of thing. And for some reason, there isn't conceptual connections, or in practice, they don't work together. So part of what I've been doing is hosting consultations, forcing for these groups to come together, to listen to each other, to understand each other. And the idea is to conceptually connect the right to food to starvation. And as I said, there's something very particular about food, water, health, and housing. They're all interconnected in a particular way. They're all really at the heart of whatever we mean by self-determination. So this idea of self-determination, I think in the context of food, is really best expressed through this notion of food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is an expression of a community's power and of indigenous peoples' power to determine how they want to make their food, share their food, eat their food, and it reflects their relationship with the land. It reflects their relationship with rivers and lakes. It reflects their relationship with their ancestors and with the future. So food sovereignty is about power and relationships in a communal sense, and people expressing who they are through their food and through the power dynamics around the making, sharing, and eating of food. It's a social movement that starts in the mid-1990s, mainly by peasant groups from Europe and Latin America, and is now a global movement and has a lot of different parts and factions and stuff. In Palestine, the two main groups that I think really work within the food sovereignty space are the Union of Agricultural Work Committees and also the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature. So in the report, by focusing on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty, what I'm looking at is in terms of the Palestinian liberation struggle. That's what's at stake here. It's not just Gaza, it's the West Bank. Because once you start looking at the Palestinian people as a people, their expression of power and their relationship with the land, then when that's your geographical and temporal scale, you quickly see that this has also been the last 2 years, there have been record degrees of violence against Palestinian farmers and peasants in the West Bank, even before Gaza happened, attacking the olive trees. So this past harvest year for olive farmers, they couldn't harvest olives. What's at stake there? So yes, of course, olives are delicious, and they're a source of food, and they're a source of livelihood for the farmer, but the olive tree lives for hundreds of years. It is a symbol of what it means to be Palestinian. So to uproot an olive tree is an attempt to uproot the Palestinian people from the land. It's trying to destroy their connection with the past and with the future. So that's, I think, how food allows us to understand, what's at stake. The other thing is, what's interesting is the degree, it's been a very difficult talk to give, but also the degree of solidarity. And again, with this room, I don't have to explain how profound this moment is. I have never seen this degree of solidarity supporting the Palestinian liberation struggle, ever. And from studying it, I don't think it's ever been this big and this strong. So just as much as I've described how bad things are, politically, it's never been this organized. This is a continuation of the 2021 Unity Intifada that started. This is a continuation of divestment campaigns that have been going on for years. Right? So all these different movements are coming together now. It's a continuation of Ferguson. The chants in Ferguson were, from Ferguson to Palestine, killing people is a crime. That was very specific. Because what people knew and still know, that the same techniques of police brutality and violence that are being used in Israel are the same ones that are being used to militarize the police force in the United States and used against people of color and queer folk. Very material specific connections. Just like everyone in this room knows how complicit US institutions are, including universities are, in enabling genocide and apartheid and settler colonialism. So what the student movements have done is they've revealed how financial markets are connected to our public institutions. And look at how the leaders' response. Oh, but the markets don't allow us to divest from genocide. The contract doesn't allow us to stop the killing of thousands of people. Right? So that tells us not just about that the system, the support of Israeli genocide tells us about where our education institutions are today. Those connections matter. That's what's happening right now. So let me end there. I promised you to end on freedom. I'm not going to end on a bummer. So when I've been thinking about Palestinian people, the Palestinian people's food sovereignty, I've been asking people and friends and friends of friends in Gaza, what are you eating? Give me a recipe. So I'm thinking maybe in the report to include a recipe. And I just got a voice note from a woman yesterday. Her name's Ahmad, and so it's anonymous enough that I can share publicly for now. And she was describing the difficulty of what she was going for. And then she gave me the recipe for a dish called simai from sumac, which is a berry which you dry, which is very sour and delicious. And she said, oh, this is a dish. It's very specific to Gaza. We cook it in moments of holidays and celebrations. And then she proceeded to explain to me how they're cooking it in the worst situation they've ever experienced since maybe the Nakba in 1948. And she's describing like this holiday dish that what she replaced this flour with that flour. Oh, we couldn't find this, so we used different plants that we foraged, et cetera, et cetera. And it struck me that when I asked for a recipe, that what she shared with was, yes, the difficulties, and you can hear it in her voice, but she shared with me that they are cooking dishes of celebration, no matter, like, despite the conditions, despite what's going on. They're making an effort of like, okay, how can we replace this with that? And so, food is that expression of resistance, of we're still here. Where every meal for a Palestinian becomes a reiteration of that resistance, of a right to return to their territory. And it's a reminder that the power and authority of food sovereignty as this collective political force, it doesn't derive from a state or a government or an institutional authority, one state, two states, whatever. That people have their own agency, their own power, their own ability to relate to the land. And food sovereignty comes from people's long-standing relationship with the land, with the rivers, with the sea, and their ability to feed their communities. And so, as you all know, a common chant is that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. But I've also said that the right to food is the right to be free from hunger. And so the question I've been asking myself is, how do we know when we're free? I mean, obviously it's not an end goal, but no one tells you you're free. I think we're free when we can feed each other, when we take care of each other, when we celebrate our lives through our meals in communion. And it's in these moments of joy and pleasure that we're free. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.